Hola, Stars fans and Cardinals and people that just happen to be watching this video, I guess. Welcome to another edition of whatever this is, Sports Mad, Angry Tirade, Dallas Stars edition, Incident Analysis, Reaction, whatever. But anyways, thank you guys for being here. And I always enjoy doing these, so as mentioned, I'll try to do them more often and more timely. This is not exactly breaking news at this point, but for those who don't know, Dallas Stars signed Blake Comeau to a 1 year, $1 million contract. And as Matthew DeFranks confirmed, this is not a contract that has performance bonuses attached, which is kind of typical these days of sort of players 35 and older, getting these kind of 1 year, 2 year deals. So there isn't going to be like a Corey Perry situation where, he's eligible for a few extra million. And so that's not a bad thing. Blake Comeau for $1 million 1 year, and yet it's inspired quite a bit of discussion. And I want to talk about that because I think it's a lot of fun. And as someone that's been involved in heated discussions about Blake Comeau, listen, I enjoyed having the discussion with the community. And however I might sound, it's never personal. I just tend to be fairly opinionated. And so, it's worth discussing because I think the reaction was very polarizing. A lot of people were just like, "Oh, this is absolute BS. Here we go with the FCC line again and freaking bonus." And some people were like, "What are you people crazy? Like Blake Comeau is exactly what you need in the playoffs. I mean, look at the top four teams right now. You need that kind of gritty, tough veteran presence." And there's, I think, some truth to like both sides, but I mean at the same time, like, listen, I'll go on record. I don't like the move. I don't care for it. It's just cotton candy on the roster. But I think we could start by saying that Blake Comeau is in a vacuum. I think he's a good player for what Dallas is trying to do, in my opinion. So, for example, one of the things I brought up in this case, the WAR numbers, compliments of Top Down Hockey and JFresh. These are wins above replacement, probably the fanciest of fancy stats. And the reason why I use these is because I think when it comes to, listen, like, I'm not somebody that is going to like tell you that when it comes to fancy stats, like, it's, this is the only way you can analyze stuff. This is exactly what you need. And sort of go the complete opposite of Pierre Maguire, who just like every night is complaining about how like you can't use analytics. There's nothing to measure, like, will over skill and all this nonsense, right? Just that when it comes to, and I should add that I wrote an article all about like what I thought was going on with Seth Jones, who is, I think when you look at him, a very elite player, and yet the underlying metrics say that no, actually he hasn't been that good over the last 3 years. But at the same time, I think, this is, as someone that, sorry, I was going to mention, so yes, I majored in philosophy, and that is not a feather in the cap at all. I think the people that know the least about how to like analyze in a careful and clear way are the philosophers. But I guess the point is that like when it comes to quote unquote advanced stats or fancy stats, I'm not here to use them as truth. I mean, these are the old philosophical discussions, right? the making the distinction between truth and facts, and the discussion between the empiricists and the rationalists, and if we want to get technical, we can include the Hegelians and the phenomenologists and so forth. And like I said, I'm not here to kind of use stats as excuse me, as the be all end all, and sort of again not make that distinction between truth and facts, because I think things are more complicated than that. So with Seth Jones, I even made the case like, hey, I think there's definitely more going on there. It's not just a matter of like he's had quote unquote bad stats and therefore is maybe not the player he's marketed to be, but which is ironic because that's not even true on the face of it. If you look at Seth Jones' wins above replacement numbers going to the previous 3 seasons, he's actually much better. Like, top 75 percentile, yada yada, right? So clearly not a player that's bad even on the surface. But at the same time, I do think that we can use stats to, I think, sort of have a kind of, get at a deeper analysis. Um, the whole thing with the Moneyball and yada yada was basically that, well, you know, was there value and efficiency within players that maybe we had previously overlooked because of certain biases or assumptions given a player's specific profile. Like a player like Roman Polak is the perfect but also worst example of what it is what it is when it comes to, like, well, you have a guy who's big, burly, this earthy brawler, and he must be good defensively, right? I mean, he's going to be tough in the corners and tough in the zone, but the same things that inform efficiency in the corners in the offensive zone are the same thing that inform efficiency in the corners in the defensive zone, which is talent, puck handling, puck protection, all these things. And so that's why Polak, for all the things that we assumed about who he was, wasn't actually true. Polak was just a bad player, but nonetheless, teams felt like he had value because, hey, he's tough, plays hard, tries hard, quote unquote, plays the right way, even if he's just completely bad at it. And so again, like, I'm not here to use them to use stats to just talk about like I'm the expert and that's all we need to evaluate a player. Again, I think it goes back to, part of the value is identifying efficiency, or maybe you didn't realize. And I think the other thing too is like, let's do a thought experiment. I realize we're on a tangent, but I'm like, you know what? If we're going to go on a tangent, let's just go all the way on the tangent. So let's consider two sets of 4 players. First you have player A and player B. Player A scored 12 goals and 8 assists last season. Player B scored 8 goals and 12 assists last season. Now consider 2 more players, player C and player D. Player C scored 5 goals and 15 assists. Player D scored 2 goals and 18 assists. So, this influenced by Daniel Kahneman, what exactly does this mean? So they all have one thing in common, which is they scored 20 points. Not terribly impressive, but only one roster spot remains. So who's the pick? Player A probably stands out the most for most people because also has the most goals. But what if half of his goals were scored on the power play? Let's go back to player B. Again, 8 goals, 12 assists for him. Seems good too. Just the right mix of goal scoring and a little dash of playmaking. His scoring was mostly at even strength. But what if his assists were mostly secondary while playing on a high-quality offensive line? Now consider player C. Again, 5 goals, 15 assists. Stands out as a raw playmaker, and teams can always use a pure passer. But what if he was an awful possession player and took a lot of penalties? Player D, again, 2 goals, 18 assists. Seems like a pure passer, just not a goal scorer at all. Good, but perhaps too much of a distributor. And he was sheltered. But what if all of his points were scored without quality teammates and he drew a lot of penalties? So the whole point with that, and again, there's not, I don't think, necessarily meant to be a right or wrong answer. It's just more of like, that exercise is meant to illustrate how much I think actual analysis is left on the table for things like playoff experience, face-off wins, tough zone starts, hits, block shots, quote-unquote leadership. And that's not to say those things are important. They are, just they can be lazy substitutes for actual analysis. And we have all the information and models and just all the data that we need to separate all that stuff, to separate all that noise. And so that's why I think, especially with players that aren't going to offer you a whole lot, right? Because you're not going to be able to measure their efficiency in just raw points. That's why I think, stats can be very useful in this particular scenario. And so kind of brings us back to Blake Comeau, and I'll kind of return back to that discussion a little bit because I do think there is a move that Dallas could have made that would have been better. But so you look at these WAR numbers and you see a player that is just provides very strong defense, no offense whatsoever, and perhaps crazily enough, not even good on the PK. In fact, he's especially bad on the PK, which you would not expect, but is nonetheless what the information bears out and what the data shows. So it's clear that Blake Comeau has one specific gear and one particular thing that he can provide Dallas, which is just defense at the forward position. And there's one thing I'll say in support of Dallas's decision to do that, which is um, if you look at right, so Dallas. One of the things that Dallas was obviously like they've stuck with this identity of defense, 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 defense. Right, this is Rick Bowness's calling card. One of the interesting things to note, and one of the reasons why I think that Jim Hill was always going to bring back one of these guys or try to try to bring back the entire FCC line if possible, or try to recreate it. Which is that when you look at the top, this is again wins above replacement. Sorry about that. At even strength, in terms of just pure defense, right? The top 20 forwards, Joe Pavelski being the very top, and Andrew Cogliano, Jason Dickinson, and Blake Comeau. So some of the absolute top defensive forwards in the NHL, and Dallas had the potential to kind of lose all these guys. I guess if we include, like, if Dallas had really been faced with a tough decision with some of their forwards, and Pavelski had kind of a relatively maybe like less interest in offensive year, Dallas could have lost all this. But instead, we know they're going to protect Pavelski, and they're certainly not bringing Cogliano back. They are probably likely to expose Dickinson, although I think RFA rules with expansion are a little bit trickier. But nonetheless, like, Dallas had the potential to lose a lot of their strongest defensive forwards here. So again, to me, like this move to bring back Comeau totally makes sense in a vacuum, and I think that's more or less the logic that Jim Hill was going by, and I think it's totally fine. That's one of the things that I would argue really supports the notion that, like, well, listen, Jim Hill, knew what he was doing here, and they're sticking with this identity, and Rick Bowness is coach next year, so why not? They had to bring back some of this strong defensive element that's really been kind of fueling that sort of that identity with this particular core for several years now. But I don't like the move, so why not? Well, I think in any other universe, this is a totally fine move. It's completely, like, it's fine. Who cares? There's nothing to really criticize. But we're not in any universe. We're in Rick Bowness's universe. And here's the thing. Like, if Blake Comeau, if I thought he was just going to be like the fourth line right winger, I'd be totally cool with it. But this guy, Comeau averaged, he was fourth in even strength minutes in ice time, even when you account for Sagan and Radulov. Now, obviously, some of that should change next season, right? Sagan, after all, he was brought back, when he finally did make it, brought back, pretty slowly. Radulov, basically just started the year and never really got going, so there was never a rhythm. And then Hintz is also a guy that, they kind of sheltered even when he did play because of his lingering injury. Nonetheless, I think it's interesting to note how Blake Comeau was leveraged, which is that this is a guy who wasn't just there to kind of hold leads, but a guy that actually Rick Bowness loved to use when it was time to tie the game late. And so, even though Blake Comeau has like just zero offensive skill to speak of. And so I think that's part of my issue, which is that Blake Comeau is, for as long as he's here, regardless of how much money he's making, there's very little evidence to indicate that he's ever going to be used as a true fourth line winger. Again, I'm not talking about like where he's put on in these like arbitrarily posted daily lineup rosters. I'm talking about the actual minutes he receives at even strength, which is where most of the game is played. And Blake Comeau was just a major part of that forward core in Rick Bowness's mind. And the other thing too that that I think is interesting to note, which is that, like, I really don't feel like there was no rush to fill the right wing spot. You have Pavelski at right wing, Radulov at right wing, and Gurianov. That should be your top three on the right side. If Blake Comeau does not get fourth line minutes, which there's no reason to think that he wouldn't, given his history of bonus, then what exactly are you doing? Are you moving one of those guys to the left hand side, like Gurianov on his left side, where he's been less efficient? I don't know, but that was why I felt like if you were going to bring someone back, why not Cogliano? As you saw with the even strength war numbers at defense, he was just as effective. Um, I was almost about to say he's better offensively. I should say he's less anemic offensively than Blake Comeau. And he was also better on the PK. So not only did Cogliano fill actually played a spot that Dallas kind of needs, in a manner of speaking, but also this was a player that was actually, like utilized fairly. Cogliano got bottom 6 minutes just as he should, whereas Blake Comeau did not. So that's kind of like that's my thing, which is that why wouldn't you just if you had to pick, why wouldn't you pick Cogliano? Now, of course, Cogliano probably wasn't going to take that deal, so that's probably the reason why, right? The 1 million 1 year deal, um, and so my whole thing is that like okay, if not, then that's fine, but still it goes back to well, you know, who is Como moving forward? Who's he going to be? How is Bonus going to deploy him? Because one of the things that I think you've seen over the years, and one of the things that's always kind of, I guess, bothered me with Jim Nill is that, listen, I don't think Jim Nill is a bad GM. I really don't. I think you've actually seen that with interviews with NHL agents who Jim Nill is always at the top of the list when it comes to GMs that people like to deal with, GMs that people feel are willing to listen and are also reasonable. And I think that shows up at the negotiating table. There's a reason why he's managed to get like the big, some of the big free agents like Radulov, like Pavelski, and so that's to his credit. So there were just like any GM, he has strengths and he has weaknesses. I think one of Jim Nill's weaknesses is his eye for these veteran stopgaps. And obviously he's had some real big hits. Like Pavelski wasn't a hit at first, but he turned into one. And you look at guys like, for example, Laura Korpikoski, Hoodler and the Hoodler virus. I think Martin Hansel was the one that really stood out the most. Because Dallas was set at the time at center. They had Sagan, they had Spezza, they had Faxa. And I can't remember, they had somebody else as well. I can't remember who it was that, I know they'd gotten rid of Cody Eakin already at the time, I think. But anyways, the point is that Martin Hansel was a guy that was never going to fit into Dallas's center depth. I mean, what was he going to do? Push like Faxa down to the middle? Now, of course, Hitchcock had it. He had a solution for that, which was to put Faxa at wing like next to Hansel, or to put Spets on his wing next to Hansel. And that just was a fantastic failure, just total nonsense. But the point is, like, it made no sense at the time, and it was just kind of one of those things where I don't know if Jim Nill truly has an eye for the nuance of positions and what they mean in relation to interlinking skills. Like Hansel was not going to make players like Faxa or Spezza better around him if that was how they were going to fit him into the game plan, which makes you question how much they really thought about, like, well, whether or not Hansel would be a fit to begin with. I think you've seen that with other players. You've seen that with other players they brought in with, whether it's like the trades for like Chris Russell and so forth. And so to me, it's just like this is another example of Jim Nill kind of just thinking in archetypes, thinking in sort of very broad ways, where it's like the opposite was true with Nichushkin, right? It's like, okay, we drafted this goal scorer, and he's not scoring goals, so he has no value whatsoever. Now, maybe that's not how they analyzed or what they said. Nonetheless, they started paying they paid another team so that he couldn't play for them, right? And of course, Colorado, identified right away what he could be, and even Dallas, even Montgomery did this. Like in the season, like towards the waning months of that season, Montgomery's last season, or I should say Nichushkin's last season under Montgomery, they played him on the PK, right? So they started to kind of identify what he could provide if he wasn't scoring goals, which of course was never going to sustain itself. Like Nichushkin wasn't going to go the rest of his NHL career not scoring any goals, but nonetheless, Dallas got impatient and just. Now I realize other things were factors there, right? Like Nichushkin's own attitude by his, something he admitted in interviews later, like just didn't work out as much, and also just the fact that Nichushkin's cap hit at the time was a problem in proportion to what he was producing. But nonetheless, like it's still that's still what analysis is all about. It's identifying the climate from the weather. Like you should have easily seen who Nichushkin was and who he could be if he wasn't going to be a goal scorer. Certainly what Colorado did. And so I think that's my thing with the Blake Comeau signing, which is that it feels too much like Jim Nill thinking very little, again, thinking in archetypes, thinking in sort of the broad strokes. And so, I mean, honestly, I would not be surprised if they do something like put Gurianov on like left wing, and then when he like kind of struggles because it's not his natural position, oh well, what happened? I mean, why accommodate someone like Blake Comeau, or have someone like Gurianov accommodate to Blake Comeau's position? And I don't know, maybe they try Comeau at left wing, maybe that's fine. But it just doesn't feel like a move that makes a lot of sense for these specific roster spots that need to be filled. And we've seen this happen before. It's not even just the Hansel signing. Right, it's happened in plenty of other situations when it comes to Jim Nill just like needing his veteran stopgaps. And I don't agree with people that feel like, it shuts down a roster spot for one of the kids. First off, guys look, Maverick Bourque I thought was an awesome pick. Huge fan of it at the time. I mean, this was a kid that was easily top 20 in the first round, and Dallas managed to pick him up at 30. But you watch his game, like Maverick Bourque or even Riley Damiani, like these are not guys that are ready. You still want them to have, when they do break in the NHL, you want them to be confident. And when I see these players in the AHL, I see very confident players at the AHL level, but not necessarily with the games that are going to allow them to keep playing confidently, if that makes sense. So I don't necessarily think that's the problem, right? Like, Blake Comeau's blocking a spot. I just feel like Blake Comeau is who should be a fourth, sort of fourth on the right wing depth chart, is not going to be played that way. In which case, what happens next? Does Gurianov play fourth line minutes? That's totally possible under Rick Bowness. And I hate that prospect because I think Gurianov is a player that absolutely needs to be in the top six. And I think he's already proven that. I think even his production, it's funny, like for all the talk about Gurianov in his like weak season, like his production wasn't like that bad. Yes, he took a step back, I think, developmentally, but production-wise, sort of did some things. I think, he's a player that should easily score at least, 40-plus points next season, which is what he was on pace for this season. But nonetheless, like I said, I would normally be completely cool with the sign, normally be okay with it, but I just don't trust Dallas and Rick Bowness in particular to do the right thing when it comes to how that ice time is actually distributed. So I'll happily be wrong, and we'll happy to have a discussion with you guys. Like I said, I'm big on sort of I'm big on having these discussions, and again, as always, I can certainly handle my verbal liquor if you can. So please, if you don't just throw a thumbs down at me. I mean, that's fine. I don't even know who the hell you are. So if you throw me a thumbs down, cool, whatever. I don't know what that does to YouTube analytics. I'm totally new to this, but nonetheless, just leave a comment. Like I said, we're here to try to understand this game better and hopefully have fun doing it, regardless of how much we disagree with each other. That's the kind of community I would like to start developing here, which is maybe a strange place to say that because YouTube usually the comments are good for just great one-liners and jokes or just utter depravity, and listen, I'm here for all that. But nonetheless, do be kind to each other, because I would like to, hear from people that feel like you're an idiot, David. You're an idiot for thinking that this should be up for discussion. Blake Comeau is a good signing. He's going to be great in the playoffs, and you watch him score the Stanley Cup winning goal next year. And listen, that'll be fantastic. I might even root for Blake Comeau, but don't ask me to live with Blake Comeau getting top 6 minutes ever. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Again, I'll try to do this when it comes to just breaking news in general and stuff like that. And when it comes to just stuff that I feel like deserves more like strict analysis, usually you can just find me writing about it at Defending Big D. But other than that, you guys have been awesome, and hope you enjoyed it, and have a great one.